This week on The Inside Story, the Trump foreign and domestic agendas take shape from the Arctic to the Middle East and immigration at home. Now, on The Inside Story, transition and policies.
Hello and welcome to The Inside Story. In Washington, I'm congressional correspondent Katherine Gibson. We begin with new Trump administration transition and policies. The administration has ordered a 3-month pause on almost all foreign development assistance, pending a review to see what fits in with the America First policy. But aid groups and human rights watchdogs say this will put countless lives around the world at risk. We get more on the policy from VOA's White House correspondent, Anita Powell.
The U.S. spent just short of $70 billion on foreign aid in fiscal year 2023, most of that through the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. The U.S. is the world's largest provider of humanitarian assistance and a global leader on HIV prevention and treatment through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief Program, or PEPFAR.
We responded to 84 humanitarian crises in 66 countries, providing life-saving aid to tens of millions of people, including those affected by devastating conflicts in Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine.
With a stroke of his pen, President Donald Trump put all but the most urgently needed food assistance on ice, part of his charge to realign the U.S.'s foreign stance with its America First policy. The order pauses new obligations and disbursements of development assistance funds for 90 days while they are reviewed.
The past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country, and it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for honestly.
The White House did not reply to VOA's questions for more details on which foreign assistance programs would be impacted. Humanitarian groups are sounding the alarm about the foreign programs, some of which focus on issues like gender equity, business development, and, critically, the provision of U.S.-funded HIV drugs, which Biden officials called a key pillar of Washington's relations with the developing world.
The Secretary General notes with concern the announcement of a pause in U.S. foreign assistance. He calls for additional exemptions to be considered to ensure the continued delivery of critical development and humanitarian activities for the most vulnerable communities around the world. Those lives and livelihoods depend on this support.
The largest single USAID project in fiscal year 2023 provided $14 billion in non-military assistance to Ukraine. Human rights watchdogs say they welcome robust accountability over U.S. taxpayer funds, but not pausing assistance during the review.
If you want to review all of the assistance, start your review. Be crystal clear on what you're looking at. Don't suspend life-sustaining and life-saving aid while you do that review.
And analysts expressed concerns about the immediate impact of the stop work order.
There are real concerns about the immediate impact of a stop work order on foreign assistance. We must remember that foreign assistance includes such humanitarian projects that relate to administration of vaccines, for example, to children around the world to make sure that they don't get communicable diseases.
On those global public health issues, Trump's stance is clear. He also announced on his first day in office that he would pull out of the World Health Organization, citing concerns that the U.S. is being ripped off as the organization's largest donor. He did the same during his first term. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
To learn more about the scope of U.S. foreign aid and how its recipients are reacting to the pause, I'm joined by VOA's Mariama Diallo via Skype from Nairobi. Good to see you, Mariama. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you give us an idea of just how much of this aid is directed to sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you, Catherine, for having me. I'm just going to look at the data real quick. This is actually, coming from USAID, basically saying that the president's fiscal year 2025 budget request actually for the State Department and U.S. International Agency for Development, USAID, was about $43 billion. And more than half of that, about 28.3 billion, is actually for USAID. So to understand the scale and know how much of that is being used and being used for help, actually in Africa, you have to look at some of the projects. They fund so many different projects, from HIV and AIDS to malaria to vaccines, humanitarian assistance, women empowerment, education.
You mentioned some of those programs that are already coming up on Capitol Hill. I was just hearing from senators who are concerned about the PEPFAR program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, the PEPFAR program was actually started by a Republican president. It was started under George W. Bush more than 20 years ago. And, a lot of people the administrations have come and gone. And, a lot of people usually don't understand that some of these programs actually they survive because they benefit from really very strong bipartisan kind of support, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. They usually have lasted. PEPFAR has benefited millions of people around the world when it comes to HIV and AIDS treatment. Just today, the head of UNAIDS talked about the fact that 20 million people, that's 2/3 of people who have HIV and AIDS, have benefited from basically this program, PEPFAR.
That's certainly what I'm hearing over on my side on Capitol Hill. A lot of bipartisan support for that program and all the other aid programs. I know there's a lot of confusion right now about exactly how this is all going to play out, but have you been able to talk to some of the aid agencies and NGOs on the ground about this?
That's a very good question. A lot of these agencies have actually, I think it's just, as you said, a lot of them are very shocked because it's so sudden. Some of them have not been able to talk to us. I think they need a little bit of time to assess exactly what happened. But today I was able to get to talk to somebody, one of a worker who works for an organization that benefits from USAID funding. And yes, he is very shocked. He and his colleagues, some of them have just basically lost their jobs for this pause, the 90-day pause.
Right.
But what he was more worried about was about the programs that he's participated in over the years, whether it's HIV and AIDS, whether it's, education, women empowerment. So he's more actually wondering about what would happen to some of those programs.
Thank you so much for telling us, giving us your perspective on the ground. It's always good to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Another of President Trump's early actions was to change birthright citizenship in the United States. Since the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, it has been challenged and affirmed by the courts to mean that if you're born or naturalized in the U.S., you are a U.S. citizen. Trump's order launched both a legal and political debate, raising questions about the extent of executive power. VOA's immigration correspondent, Eleni Barros, tells us more.
The U.S. Constitution, drafted in the late 18th century, left much of the decision-making regarding immigration and citizenship to Congress. But President Donald Trump has signed an executive order ending birthright citizenship in the United States.
We're the only country in the world that does this with birthright, as you know. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. But, we'll see. We have very good grounds. People have wanted to do this for decades.
Critics of Trump's executive order say the 14th Amendment is a cornerstone of civil rights and cannot be pulled away by a U.S. president.
Originally, it was to ensure that Black slaves were able to get citizenship, and this is enshrined in Dred Scott, the case. And constitutional amendments cannot, and constitutional rights cannot be taken away by a president.
However, supporters of the executive order argue it is necessary to restore fairness in the immigration system.
President Trump has made it clear that restoring fairness to our immigration system and defending the true intent of the 14th Amendment are central to his vision of making America great again. His historic executive order to end birthright citizenship marks a critical step forward.
The executive order faces significant legal challenges, with multiple lawsuits already in progress. Democratic attorneys general from 22 states have filed lawsuits arguing the order violates the 14th Amendment.
The Supreme Court reaffirmed it in a case where a lot of Chinese immigrants' citizenship was disputed, and the court reaffirmed that the 14th Amendment applied to these Chinese immigrants and they were able to get citizenship.
A federal judge in Seattle temporarily stopped the birthright citizenship order from taking place. If the case reaches the Supreme Court, the outcome could shape the nation's understanding of citizenship. If the order is allowed to move forward, the most immediate impact will be on newborns and those yet to receive birth certificates and Social Security numbers. Aline Barros, VOA News, Washington.
Moving now to the Middle East. While speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, Mr. Trump proposed that Jordan and Egypt take in Palestinians so Gaza can be cleared out. The proposal was promptly rejected by Jordan, but welcomed by some Israeli officials. Linda Gradstein reports from Jerusalem.
President Trump's newest proposal for managing the Middle East conflict by sending Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan is emblematic of what many in Israel see as an unconventional approach to foreign policy, one that could bring results that Israel wants to see, like an aggressive approach to Israel's top enemy, Iran. Many Israelis, especially supporters of the right-wing government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, expect Israel to benefit from many of these policies, as they did during President Trump's first presidential term.
I believe that working together again, we will raise the U.S.-Israel alliance to even greater heights. I'm confident that we will complete the defeat of Iran's terror axis and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity for our region.
Some Israeli analysts say that with Trump's support, Israel can pursue the destruction of Iran's nuclear program after Israel weakened Iranian defense systems and Iran's proxies in Gaza and Lebanon.
Israel very much needs the support, cooperation, collaboration, and moral clarity of the incoming Trump administration in order to finally, perhaps, eliminate the Iranian regime leadership and its nuclear program.
Other analysts say they are not sure if President Trump will support Israeli military action against Iran.
He would first try to push for a deal, a different deal than the one that he opted out of course, but that would be his first priority.
President Trump says he wants to expand the Abraham Accords his previous administration negotiated among Israel and the Gulf states by engineering a peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
He wants to be the guy to do, the deal of the century. The more Israel normalizes its relations with the Gulf states, the more they can cooperate together to deal with security threats like Iran and like ISIS, the less America has to do. And from Trump's point of view, in the grand scheme of things, he wants America to do less.
Saudi Arabia has stated that any Israeli-Saudi peace deal would be conditioned on progress toward a Palestinian state, a policy rejected by Israel's right-wing government. This could be a source of friction between Trump and Israeli leaders.
He will be looking for a deal on some sort of a Palestinian entity in the West Bank to try to resolve that finally with Israel. That would indicate that Israel needs to be out in front of that issue and make a number of different alternatives
President Trump has pledged to end all wars and has widely received credit in Israel for the current ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. But finding lasting solutions to Middle East conflicts may be an even tougher challenge for the returning U.S. president. Linda Gradstein, VOA News, Jerusalem.
In his inaugural address, Mr. Trump vowed to put the Panama Canal back under the control of the United States amid fears of growing Chinese encroachment. U.S. senators recently examined security concerns regarding the key shipping route and examined possible next steps.
And they built the thing called the Panama Canal.
Just days after taking office, President Donald Trump told Republican lawmakers he wants the key global shipping lane, the Panama Canal, back under U.S. control, saying American shipping is not being treated fairly.
China essentially has taken it over, and we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let that happen. It was the biggest investment to this day ever made by the country.
Republican lawmakers said Tuesday the canal poses a national security risk.
Chinese companies are right now building a bridge across the canal at a slow pace so as to take nearly a decade. And Chinese companies control container ports at either end. The partially completed bridge gives China the ability to block the canal without warning. And the ports give China ready observation posts to time that action. This situation, I believe, poses acute risks to U.S. national security. Meanwhile, the high fees for canal transit disproportionately affect Americans.
The United States built the canal in 1914 and operated it until 1977, when it transferred control to Panama. Earlier this month, Panamanian President Jose Raul Mulino said the canal would continue to belong to his country.
Panama sigue adelante.
Panama is not distracted by this type of pronouncement. Over time, we have been an ally and friend of the United States.
About 72% of the goods transiting the canal are coming either to or from American markets. The Panama Canal Treaty protects the international neutrality of the shipping lane and allows the U.S. to intervene if that is threatened.
If Panama signed a treaty with the People's Republic of China, whereby the latter would operate the canal on Panama's behalf, this would be a clear violation. But what if Panama contracted for port operations with a Chinese state firm, or even a private firm influenced or controlled in part by the Chinese government? In other words, a company need not be owned by the government to be in part controlled by the government.
Senator Maria Cantwell, the top Democrat on the Senate Commerce Committee, called for stronger trade agreements and increases in cybersecurity to address the problem.
The larger issue is we need to understand what are the shortfalls of the current agreement that doesn't get at this upgraded technology concern. I would hope that Panama would be very cooperative in discussing these cybersecurity investments and what needs to be made.
One analyst told VOA proposed legislation like the Americas Act could help address those problems.
At the end of the day, it really does come down to investment in the Americas. It's the most powerful tool for countering China's growing influence in the region. Because commerce then means that the countries in which this investment is going to create more jobs. You're going to have more prosperity. You'll see fewer people needing to migrate to the United States.
In his first international trip as Secretary of State, Marco Rubio is set to visit Panama in early February. President Trump recently said he wants control of the Danish-owned island of Greenland, citing national and even global security concerns. Only about 57,000 people live in the vast Arctic territory, but the indigenous population has long pushed for full sovereignty, driven by resentment over Danish rule and a desire to chart their own future. Henry Ridgewell reports from Greenland's capital, Nuuk, where Trump's recent comments stirred an independence debate among indigenous people who describe a deep connection with their homeland.
This spot is known locally as the edge of the world. For Inuit artist and researcher Vivi Vold, it is a place of retreat into nature, intrinsic to her Greenlandic identity.
I sense that there is more pride now than before. The pride has always been there, but it seems like now there is more acceptance of it. Everything I do is about the land and nature, hunting, the climate, and the way we think.
A statue of the missionary Hans Egder stands over the capital, Nuuk. Greenlanders have lived under varying degrees of Danish rule ever since Egder landed here in 1721. The government is now largely autonomous and is pushing for full independence.
We need to be able to discuss amongst ourselves how will independence look like, what kind of welfare do we want, what kind of democracy, what kind of institutions should guard it, what kind of constitution. We want those debates for ourselves.
Could Greenland stand on its own? Just 57,000 people inhabit the island's 2.1 million square kilometres. Denmark pays an annual grant of around $800 million, half the government's revenue. There are hopes that the global attention now on Greenland will unlock investment to exploit its vast mineral wealth. A new international airport opened in November, and the island's stark beauty is attracting more tourists. For now, fishing is Greenland's biggest industry by far, making up some 85% of total exports. It is deeply entwined with the Greenlandic way of life. Jesper Jacobsen, who runs a fishing cooperative in Nuuk, says Greenland can be independent.
We have fish and we have natural resources, and the Americans could pay a lot of money to rent the northern part of Greenland. They could use it for their military. Then we will have our independence because the Americans will pay a lot to rent the northern part of Greenland.
A Make America Great Again, or MAGA, hat hangs in Jacobsen's office, given by Donald Trump Jr.'s entourage when the US president's son visited Greenland in early January. The visit continues to cause a stir. YouTubers arrived in the wake of Trump Jr.'s visit, handing out US dollars and hats bearing the slogan, "Make Greenland Great Again." Some locals welcome the attention.
I don't want to be a part of Denmark.
Why?
I don't like Danish. They took children and they colonized us.
That's a reference to a 1950s programme by the Danish state where Greenlandic children were taken to Denmark. Separately, in 2022, it emerged that Danish doctors in the 1960s and 70s implanted contraceptive devices in Inuit women and girls without their permission. The scandals have further fueled the campaign for independence. Colonial history has collided with global geopolitics, putting Greenland at the centre of world attention. Its government has a clear message.
We have said very precisely that Greenland and us in this country do not want to be Americans. We don't want to be Danes either. We are Greenlanders.
There is a palpable sense of growing Greenlandic identity. But the future of this island and its people remain far from clear. Henry Ridgewell, VOA News, Nuuk, Greenland.
Now, before we go this week, around 50 survivors joined world leaders marking the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Polish President Andrzej Duda delivered a speech, and several survivors laid wreaths at the site. The Nazis systematically murdered around 1.1 million people at the Auschwitz death camps alone from 1940 to 1945. The overwhelming majority were Jewish. Ahead of the ceremony, some survivors urged the world to never forget the lessons of the Holocaust. That's all for this week's edition of The Inside Story. Stay with voanews.com for the latest news affecting the world and your world. I'm Katherine Gypson, and we'll see you again next week for more of the Inside Story.